I don't think God cares at all what people think. I think he cares what we do. What we do is a reflection of who we are inside. That is the whole reason we exist on this earth. It is life is a test to see if what you say you believe, what you might think or say you think in your head, is real. Do you think generosity is a good thing, or are you generous? Do you think kindness towards strangers is a good idea, or are you kind towards strangers? Life is to see what is within you, and God cares about that. That's the reason we exist on this earth. It is a test of the soul to see the character within it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lens Deconstructed podcast. This is a podcast where we come together to discuss the Bible and explore the lens of the ancient authors. My name is Daniel Owen, and I'm a journalist.
My name is Brent Eisen. I am a truck driver and also a Bible nerd.
We're just two average guys with a serious interest in the Bible and a whole lot of questions. Each week, we will examine passages and topics and try to deconstruct the lenses we often use to understand them.
We want to be an information hub for those of us who want to learn more about the Bible from the perspective of ancient Israel and first century Judea, or to discuss the language, history, culture, geography, and spiritual worldviews found in the Bible.
Lastly, at the Lens Deconstructed, we neither have all the answers, nor do we want you to make our theology your own. Instead, we are here to empower you with the tools and context to better understand who God is and what exactly he expects from each of us.
So if you are interested in joining us on our journey, we would like to welcome you to the Lens Deconstructed. Welcome back, everyone, to the Lens Deconstructed. We've been talking in the past few episodes about the doctrine of original sin, some different reasons why we really don't agree with it, actually why we're wholeheartedly against it. I do feel like it's a pillar in a lot of denominations that you see out there today. I feel like we have done a pretty good job at removing that one small pillar. But so remember, before we get into this, no lenses here. So no preconceived notions, anything like that. Let's just get ready to dive into the text, dive into some history, dive into some context.
Yeah, so where I'd like to go today, with what time we have, is to sort of define what sin is from a biblical standpoint, and to just take apart a couple of words, because what I think is true in any discussion about the Bible, if we don't start from a clear understanding of the definitions of the terms that we're using, oftentimes we're like talking the same, we're using the same words, but we're missing each other at 30,000 feet, like
Talking past each other.
Yeah, we are blitzing past each other, and I've seen so many arguments devolve into chaos because two people are saying this, using the same words to say something different, and they don't realize that the fundamental difference is in how they're thinking about the words. To our benefit, we have the ability to define words in the Bible using the biblical definition. So I think before we go much further today, because we've talked now for a couple episodes, I think it was 2 or 3, I can't remember, about original sin and what it was traditionally, as far as where the idea has come from. But I think it's a time, maybe past time, that we should discuss like what sin is in the mind of the biblical authors, ancient Israel, first century Judea, the mind of God. What does he see sin as? And so to that end, in Hebrew, the word for sin is hatah. It's spelled, if you were to transliterate it, that means use English letters to spell the sound of the Hebrew word. It'd be C-H-A-T-A, chata. The CH has a ch sound, sort of that guttural sound in Hebrew. And it literally means to miss the mark. And in the case of chata, it's the idea of this archer shooting an arrow at a target, and then he misses with his shot.
If you're bringing that definition up, I always like to actually interject this whenever I'm in a conversation about exactly what sin is, right? Because I've had this conversation many times. A lot of times, believers and non-believers have this idea that sin is just doing something bad. It's not just simply doing something in the whatever bad means, right? We need to narrow it down more. Bad is anything that is missing the mark of what God set as the mark, right? I always like to tell them an archer knows where he's shooting, right? He
Yeah.
knows what the target is. So that's, as a believer, our target right there is God. He's right in the middle. Holiness, righteousness. It's God. That's what we're aiming at.
Or what he has designed us for.
Yeah.
In this case, God could be the archer, and he's releasing an arrow, and we're the arrow. And if we hit the target, if we follow the trajectory that he set in front of us, when we hit the target, this is we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. So practically speaking, it's a metaphor wherein someone intends a particular outcome, but the arrow fails to hit the target. So this is chata. So it's an action that is done in a manner it wasn't intended to be done. If that makes more sense. In fact, I think it's a good point, because there's a few words I want to go through that are related to, say, sin or transgression or iniquity. We sort of lump these words together to mean the same thing. They don't in Hebrew. But I think it's interesting to pause for just a moment and point out, and if we want to understand the ancient Hebrew writer, we have to think the way they think or thought. And one of the questions I ask when I'm doing Bible studies is, to someone who's maybe unfamiliar with this way of thinking, is how would you, if you had to pause this video here, how would you define something as common in Christianese, right, in Christian speak, as good and evil? How would you define that? And the problem with defining something like good or evil in English, these are abstract. These are very abstract principles, concepts. In Hebrew, they're not. They're very concrete. So these are clearly defined, practical terms. So when we're looking at the definitions of the Hebrew author, we have to start to think, well, I might think of good as this, or evil as this, or sin as this, or iniquity as this, but how did they see it? And so, for example, if you want to know what good is in Hebrew, the word in Hebrew is tov, and that would literally translate to something that's functional, something that works correctly. It works as it was designed. If you were to, say, use a hammer to put a nail into a block of wood, that hammer is being used functionally. It's correctly. It's using right. Now, on the other hand, you have what's called ra, R-A-H. This is where we get our word evil, but it literally just means dysfunctional, something used in a manner it's not intended. So if you were to use a wrench to drive a nail into the block of wood, well, that's not what it was used for. It would be a dysfunction. It would be used outside of something's intended function. Now, this is a massive simplification. I'm not saying using a wrench to drive a nail into a block of wood is evil, but we're saying that we're showing you that the ancient authors are thinking in terms of function and dysfunction, not which are concrete, not abstract ideas of good and evil that are really hard to pin down.
And it's actually concrete ideas, because their whole perspective is the creator, right? God is the one who has designed this thing, right? If we're talking about humanity, he designed humanity to have a particular function in the world. And so I love the beautiful simplification that you actually brought to it, is saying that anything that man does outside of God's intentions for that design, right? To be ambassadors, to spread his ways around the world, You know what I mean? All the way from the garden. This
Yeah.
simplification of it really actually lends to some really good understanding of why God is so particular in what we do and do not do, the boundaries that He set. He is the designer, right? He's the Swiss watchmaker.
Yeah,
He knows what we're supposed to do.
he's the architect, right? So if
Yeah.
God is the architect and He has a set of blueprints and a plan for how things are to work, imagine you're a structural engineer putting together a bridge. And the bridge calls for certain high grade braided steel cable to be able to support the span of this bridge. And instead of using what you've called for to support the weight of your construction, the project manager who's got his crew out there working on the bridge decides to use galvanized steel chain. How well would that hold up a bridge, right? It's not designed for that purpose, and the end would be catastrophic. You'd have, if it was even able to be built, it would fall under its own weight, and people would die. And this is the point. God isn't giving frivolous commands just to keep us occupied. Imagine a world where no one murdered. Imagine what a world would look like where there was no rape, there was no murder, there was no theft. There was no deceit. And so I sort of paint the picture this way sometimes when I talk about this, is like, now imagine you have that perfect society where people are orderly and they're not doing these evil things. And then one person walks into that and starts just doing whatever they want, whatever they feel in the moment. Imagine the ripple effect, the wake of chaos that they would leave behind them, having abandoned this idea of following God's commands. And that's really what we're dealing with, but on a global scale where billions of people are doing it. We're just ignoring what God has told us, and we're doing whatever we want. Yeah. And so these commands aren't frivolous, but so to get back to, because what we're really talking about here is, what is sin? I think it's important to mention, because we mentioned chata, which is to miss the mark. Well, what would hitting the mark look like? What would that be? And this is where we get the word Torah. Torah comes from a Hebrew root word, which is yara, and it literally means that which is thrown or shot by an archer. So Torah literally means to hit the mark. So Torah is the opposite of chata, sin. So Torah is God's ways for doing things correctly. Sin is anything else. God says to this is how you will treat your neighbor. Here are these rules for how you interact with your neighbor. Anything outside of that, so for example, if you were to steal from your neighbor, there's this whole list of rules on how you are to reconcile to make things right. If you don't do it that way, then you're considered outside of the way God intended it, and you've missed the mark. You've sinned. And there are a few other words that I think are important to talk about.
Well, before you go any further,
Go ahead.
what you said right there, actually, one, you taught me something, so thank you. But two, to reach back into one of the last couple episodes that we did, we talked about feeling the ramifications of someone else's sin, right? Not being held accountable for someone else's sin, but still having to deal with the ramifications. Something that is kind of foreign to us because we're so individualistic in how we live is the dependency that you had on family members and community members back then. And I think what you pointed out right there is so interesting. You said if everyone's living in God's ways, right? If everyone is following Torah and keeping his ways and hitting the mark, that chaos that comes in is just felt by everyone in that community. That sin that has entered in from that one person missing the mark can just be so devastating to an entire community. I mean, you see the children growing up and looking at that, and they're introduced to this idea of self-preservation, of selfishness.
Well, this is why God says that he chose Israel. He chose them because they would teach their children how to keep God's ways, right? To keep Torah. it was because of this commitment by the Israelites to keep God's ways that he chose them from all the nations. Imagine, East LA, South Side Chicago, what used to be, it's like South Bronx in New York, these major areas of high crime. And imagine if those areas were to obey, say, one or two principles, not to murder your neighbor. You're not allowed to murder someone. And what that effect would have on bringing peace to an entire society. But we can see the opposite effect. And this is why when God says things like, I put before you life and death, choose life. God's ways are life. The departure from God's ways will inevitably bring death. And I think a lot of people think it as God sitting on a cloud with a lightning bolt waiting to strike someone dead when they break his commandment. He doesn't have to do that. The destruction is in the deed. The thing that brings destruction is the thing he's trying to keep you from doing. Murder kills. And disease can spread. Things can happen as a byproduct of disobedience. And so God is saying, I'm trying to keep you away from it. There's death all around you, possibly. And if you follow my map, you will avoid the pitfalls that will lead you to death. God is much more interested in bringing his mercy than he is about bringing his wrath. He created you. But the nature of sin is that it itself causes death. So he's telling you, if you just follow my way, you won't have to taste it.
There's this idea every time I seem to have this conversation about Christianity, that God is so restrictive, right? He's this figure in the sky that wants to keep you from doing things that are fun and wants to limit your ability to have pleasure in the world and things like that. I've had this conversation over and over and over. It seems that's like the overarching idea of what God's commandments are, or the things that the Bible says to do. That's what the goal is. That's just the furthest thing from the truth. The biblical authors paint this picture of a loving father. There's this story where these children, it's a bunch of boys, right? Think middle school years, so 12 to 14, 15, maybe some 16. They're all on top of this great mountain, right? And it's like 2 or 3 acres right on top, but it's this lush garden. I mean, everything you could possibly want. There's fruit trees, there's vegetables growing in the ground, there's fresh water, everything you could want, and it's sunny every day, right? Paradise. And they have this big wall around the entire top of the mountain to protect them from falling off the side. Well, one day, a person, if you will, ventures up the side of the mountain, knocks on the door, and the boys answer. And they say, who are you? What do you want? And he says, this is awesome what you guys have here. I heard you playing, so I came up to check who was up here. And I just have one question. Wouldn't you like to be free? He says, really, you're caged in up here, like animals. What you should do is remove this wall, and that way you can actually enjoy your freedom. So the boys are talked into it. They say, yeah, that's a good idea. So they take down the wall. The guy comes up the next day, but on his way up the mountain, he notices something. There's no laughter. There's no joy. There's no playing. He gets up to the top of the mountain and he looks for the boys, and he sees them all huddled in the very middle of the top of the mountain. And he says, boys, what's wrong? Aren't you enjoying your freedom? And they said, yeah, well, we were, until one of our friends got too close to the side and he fell off and he died. And so the question at the end of the story is, which group were free? The ones who had the wall or the one who didn't? It's a trick question because they're both free, but one of them is protected. The ones that had the protective wall that kept them safe actually enabled them to enjoy their freedom. Freedom is from God, but he has given us this Torah so we can enjoy it.
Absolutely, exactly that. I think that's a fantastic illustration. We learn things as a society, and we pass down that wisdom. And for some reason, in our culture and society over the past, especially in the West, over the past couple of decades, we've been sort of bent around this idea that all tradition is oppressive, and that true liberation is in the rejection of all tradition. Now, here at the Lens Deconstructed, we're about deconstructing bad tradition. But
Amen.
there's an emphasis on bad tradition, and you don't throw it all out. You sift through and you find what is good. So one of the greatest minds I know, our pastor, he has this expression: to eat the fish and spit out the bones. Sift through and find the good. Keep it. It can be beneficial. It can save your life. Toss the parts that are, say, truly oppressive or truly limiting for no real reason. You can set that aside. And so I think, I think that's a beautiful illustration of this idea. God is trying to protect us. He's not trying to oppress us. He's trying to say, hey, you can do whatever you want. You're allowed to do whatever you want. However, if you go down that way will kill you, because that way has a myriad of obstacles that will take your life. That way, it won't kill you. In fact, that way, you'll live. You'll live forever. So, choose that way. Now, the choice is yours. You're free to make your own choice. God is not going to. He's not saying, "I'm going to wait it there, and if you start walking that way, I'm going to murder you." It's not what God's saying. He's saying that way it will kill you.
Yeah, there's a consequence to that way.
There are traps along the path. There are cliffs that you can fall. There are things that will take your life. If you go this way, it won't. And so God's Torah is like that. When you think about God's commandments, because people will inevitably say, well, that's just God just trying to control me. Think about it like this. If it's how would everyone want their neighbor to live? Would it be good if you knew without any doubt in your mind, with 100% certainty, that your neighbor would never try to steal from you, would never lie to you, would never try to, take your spouse, would never murder you, God forbid? You knew that your neighbor would never break one of those rules. I think everybody would want that neighbor. The neighbor who would constantly consider you when they're making choices. Imagine that neighbor. If it's good for your neighbor, it's good for you. And this is the point that I'm trying to make, is that God's Torah is trying to provide society with shalom, with peace, with one another and with God. So these are not restrictive. These are liberating. A commandment that says you can't do something that will bring destruction is liberating, because it's telling you what that action will inevitably bring and result in your life. You'll see mourning, you'll see suffering, you'll see pain. Do you want to see those things? You can. Do you want to? And so, I want to go back briefly, because again, we talked about before, we're trying to define sin, right? And so there are a lot of terms that we will talk about as we go through this podcast series, and into other topics, that it's so important to remember. Not every word that is about a subject is the same thing. I will hear all the time people will talk about righteousness and salvation. Those are the same thing. They're not the same thing, biblically speaking. Rebellion, sin, transgression, iniquity. These are not the same words. They mean something specific. And so I want to go through another few words. We talked about chata, which is to miss the mark. There's another word here, I think, that is a little bit more sinister. It's pasha. Pasha means to rebel, or say to transgress, like a boundary that God has established. So God says, "Don't do this." We go after it. Right? That's the thing I'm going to go do. So rebellion is willfully choosing. Yep. Go ahead.
Sorry. So this comes with the idea of the way you said, transgressing a boundary that you already know has been established, right? Is that what makes this more? You said it was more sinister.
Yeah, it's sinister in that the intention is to transgress it.
Okay.
Right. So it's not like, oops, didn't mean to do that. It's more, yeah, I'm gonna do it.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Stop me. Right. So, and it can be less intentional than that. It's not to say that it's always with that intention of of intentional rebellion, like raising your fist to God sort of rebellion. But it's the acknowledgement that God has made a commandment that you can't do something, but you're going to do it anyway. And so, I want you to, if you take a moment, go to Deuteronomy 12 verse 8 in your Bibles. We can pause this video, read that. I'll read it for you here. It says, "You shall not do according to all that we are doing here today." Now, as a reminder, this is Israel. They're this is during the Exodus story. They're leaving Egypt, and God is getting ready to bring them to Sinai, where He's going to teach them how this redeemed nation is supposed to behave from now on. Because when they were living in Egypt, they did as the Egyptians did. And it says it right here. It says, "You shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever was right in his own eyes." Back in the Garden of Eden, we find this idea of one being deceived, someone being, like in this case, Adam and Eve, they're deceived into rejecting God's definition of what is good and what is evil. God defined good and evil to them by saying, "Eat whatever you want except for that." So God sets before them a commandment, right? A mitzvah in Hebrew. You can do all of these things. There's one thing you can't do. If you do that thing, it will kill you. Now, we could talk for days about what that whole story means, and it's fascinating. But what I would like to say is the idea of eating the piece of fruit is not the problem. Eating the piece of fruit is not the problem. The problem is that God said don't. And God defined for them in that moment what His expectations were. They decided to rebel against God and to do the thing He just commanded them not to do. So they've now taken what God's definition of good and evil was and set it aside. No, we'll define for ourselves what is okay and what is not okay. And
We'll
this
play
is
the role of God. Yeah.
We'll play the role of God. We'll create for ourselves whatever we believe to be good and evil. This is the knowledge of good and evil. That's the tree. That's the point of the tree. Is it a real tree? Is it a metaphor? I'd say it's both. But the point of it is, it's not about taking a bite of the fruit. It's about redefining God's commandments and saying we'll do whatever is right in our own eyes, which is what we're finding in Deuteronomy 12:8. This is the idea that's pashah, it's to rebel and to define for yourself. There's another word I want to make just quick mention of, which is ma'al, and this is an unfaithful or treacherous act. There's a word auvan, which is iniquity or guilt. Resha is another word. It's more of like a wickedness, something you'd see, in the immorality of the pagans. And finally, there's another word here, ta'a, which is to be led astray or to be deceived, sort of seduction, to be seduced away. But the point of all these terms, and I'll just give you a quick recap. We have disobedience to God's commandments, rebellion against God Himself and His ways. You have unfaithful treachery, and then you have sort of this wandering astray. Each of these definitions that sort of surround these words, right? Sin, rebellion, transgression, iniquity, wickedness, these things. Each of them require something to be done, an action to be done on the part of the offender. They're not built within their DNA. They're not something you can do without doing it. It's something that you must do. And in the concept of original sin, this is a problem, because every method of doing something against God requires an action on behalf of the offender.
I think that's really powerful, actually. That I'd never thought about it that way, or maybe I had. I just hadn't put it to words. But this idea that there are so many different things that the Bible is talking about. I mean, if you did word studies on these words, like you did, obviously, you just come away with a much more nuanced understanding of what God's telling his people all the time.
Yeah, it's it's unfortunate that within Christianity, and sort of all of its variations, we've distilled truth into words and talking points which sort of have lost their meaning. If you talk to, say, an evangelical Christian, you say things like holiness and sin and salvation. You sort of have like these sort of hit words, these words, like these bullet point words that we become so familiar with that they've lost the meaning and impact, and we don't pause when we see them to sort of take a closer look at what is actually being said. And I think it's very beneficial to as you're going through the Bible, as you're spending time. So reading the Bible is not studying the Bible. Reading the Bible is reading the Bible. Reading a story, say, in context, to try to follow the train of thought. To study the Bible is to sort of break down what's being said so that you can understand who is the author, who are they speaking to, what are they saying when they refer to this passage here, and why are they hinting at these other passages there, and what is being really breaking down, the terms, breaking down, the language. So I think it's really important. I think it's a lost art within Christianity, and because it's a lost art within Christianity, we're dealing with, and no offense here, but we're dealing with widespread biblical illiteracy within Christianity.
We've treated it almost like we actually treat the English language. As you were talking there, and you said that these words have lost their meaning. It's like I've heard this so many times from so many different people. I can't even dream to cite it, but it was the word awesome. How overused this word is now in the English language. But awesome is awe-inspiring.
Love.
And I mean, like that pizza, right?
Yeah,
The pizza that we had last night, is not awesome.
Yeah.
People say it's awesome all the time. It did not inspire awe in you, but just like that word.
Or yeah, exactly. Or when I moved to a non-English speaking country, and you learn that we say things like, "Yeah, that pizza was awesome. I love it." They don't quite understand why you would love pizza. Love is a deep emotion reserved for certain uses, and we use it sort of indiscriminately. And yeah, I think we've lost the meaning of a lot of things. We live in a society that, because you erode away at, say, certain traditions, you are now left with words that don't have a connection, that don't have a concrete understanding, and so you just redefine them to mean whatever you want them to mean. That's a dangerous game when you're dealing with ancient texts.
With God's word.
Yeah, you can't say an author said something that the author clearly didn't intend to be said. I wanted to take a second to bring this full circle, because I have a feeling that there will be a lot of people who have a hard time with us going to the Old Testament for whatever reason, for a lot of this information. So I want to bring it into the New Testament for those folks who might have a hard time with it. And so in the New Testament, we can see exactly what we're discussing here. This whole idea about sin being chata, missing the mark, Torah is hitting the mark, all of that. And so if you look at 1 John, not the Gospel of John, but 1 John, chapter 3, verse 4, we have the writer who says it like this: "Everyone who keeps on sinning is violating the law. Indeed, sin is violation of the law." Now, for the non-Greek speaker, or someone who is unfamiliar with what this is talking about, what's the law? I mean, that doesn't mean anything like civil law. The word in Greek is nomos, and nomos to the Greek mind literally means civil law. But so is the writer talking about some sort of civil law that is universal? Like, what are they actually talking about here? So nomos here is the Greek translation of a Hebrew word, Torah, which is what we've been talking about. We can find evidence of this throughout the entire Old Testament in the Septuagint, which as we discussed in the last podcast, was a Greek translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. Everywhere that we see Torah used, they would translate with the word nomos. And so when we see that sin is violation of the nomos, that means sin is violation of God's Torah. This is pretty clear. This is pretty basic. This is not a controversial assumption that's being made. And so what I want everyone to see here is that the writer here is explaining that sin, chata, is violation of Torah right here in the New Testament. And in fact, if you want to hear what Christ has to say about this, in Matthew 5, verse 19, we hear Jesus himself say, "Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments," now, he's literally talking about Torah commandments as he's writing this, "and teaches others to do the same, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So we're not going to go too far into this, but I want you just to see that the New Testament authors, without giving you a whole bunch of examples, are tracking right here too, that the value of God's Torah is incredibly relevant even today. I want to give you one more, and this is Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. And this is, again, through Jesus himself. He says, "Not everyone who says to me," and I want to tell you why this is important. I actually had a conversation with a gentleman recently who said, "Oh, don't you know that everything Jesus says in the New Testament regarding," because you can't get away from the fact that Jesus is keeping Torah and telling his followers to keep it. And so he says, "Don't you know that the Old Testament dies the moment he's nailed to the cross, and that everything that happens after that, the Torah is completely irrelevant for the non-Jewish believer in Jesus." So I want you to see what Jesus says regarding the future.
It's pretty extreme.
Right. So yeah, this was a question that was thrown at me just recently, and so I showed him this where Jesus talks about what is going to happen in the last day, the great judgment. And so in Matthew 7, 21 through 23, it says, "Not everyone that says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day," meaning the great day of judgment, this finality moment in human history, on that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" Lawlessness, and the Greek anomia. A means without, nomos, Torah. You can't escape it. Anomia is those who don't have my Torah. I know this is a controversial statement, but
Would
it
a
says
fair
what it
way
says.
would a fair way to understand that be "Depart from me, you people who have rebelled against my ways"? Is that fair?
No, because I wouldn't. Here's why I would say no, because you'll see some translations will say, "You workers of iniquity, you who practice iniquity, you who practice lawlessness." Specifically here, anomia is is something where the Torah is not respected, right? It's transgressed. It's someone who is practicing, meaning actively practicing no Torah. So they've rejected it essentially from what this is saying. So they're lawless. This is the description that was given to pagans. They're lawless. They're anemic. They have no Torah. So think about this as far as like Greek words. A theist would be someone who has the belief in a god or gods. An atheist is someone who has no god or gods. So it's the A here is the without or the against or the no, right? So this is literally saying anomia, those without Torah. So he's telling them whoever is practicing Torahlessness or lawlessness, that he'll say, I never knew you, depart from me. Now,
That kind of brings some weight to the verse that says, write these words on your heart.
yeah, I mean, we do see that God will write his Torah on our hearts. But think about that's what the conscience is, you know. I remember someone years ago, they were telling me how, you know, he will make a covenant with us, he will write his Torah on our hearts. And that's why we have a conscience. Con meaning with, and science meaning knowledge. Conscience, so with knowledge. So that everything we do with the knowledge of it being right or wrong, based on a conscience that is outside of our own sort of natural inclination. It's this standard from which we are comparing our actions and behavior versus that which we know to be correct. And this isn't a Western invention. Some people say, they'll argue, oh, the conscience is sort of that, you know, nurtured perspective that's sort of grained in from birth. Cross culturally, people know murder is wrong. Societies that have never experienced some Western Christian thinking, they know very well that murder is something you should not do. So, you know, I sort of reject that as a claim, but that gets us away from where I think we should go. But I want to sort of end with like this sort of my monologuing here, with the point sort of bringing it back home before we talk about a few questions, which is that, you know, again, just a slight recap. God is providing us with his way of truth. Torah literally means God's teachings, his guidance, his instruction, the same way, like you mentioned before, like a parent fathers his child. A father, he walks up to a street corner with his son. The son lets go of his hand and goes to walk out. The father doesn't sit there and watch the son walk into traffic. He puts his hand on his chest and says, no, son, that's dangerous. Don't do that. He's teaching his son. He's guiding his son. He teaches him how to live. He teaches his son how to, or daughter, how, I have 3 daughters, so sons or daughters, all the same. A parent, a good parent, teaches their children how to avoid pitfalls and how to live in a way that will, one, help you have a successful relationship with other people, to work well within your community or your society, how to be a good neighbor, how to be a good future parent, you know, how to work well with others and how to live an upright life. That's a good parent. That's what Torah is. God, as our Father, teaching us how to behave so that we don't die, so that we don't have sorrow and pain and suffering. You know, imagine a world where no one committed adultery. Imagine what impact would that have on our society if every hurt that's ever happened. I mean, imagine how many murders wouldn't happen if there was just no adultery. Imagine how much destruction within the homes wouldn't have happened. Imagine how many homes wouldn't be broken, leaving children with parents who hate each other. Just imagine what the ripple effects for the good would be if that one thing didn't happen. So when we obey God's commandment, it brings good. This is what we talked about a few podcast episodes ago. When we transgress God's commandments, everyone around us feels the negative impact of it, the consequence of it, even though they're not held responsible for that, for our guilt. But when we do good, when we are righteous in our ways, that is the circle of impact is much broader. So many people are affected by what we do that is right, even though sometimes it doesn't feel that way. When we walk in a way that is right and our children see that affects generations. You know, one bad deed might affect a group of people, but a lifetime of righteous living will affect generations.
No, that's beautiful. Actually, all of these verses are kind of flashing in my head right now. You get the psalm that says, I don't want to misspeak here. Hang on one second.
Paraphrase it.
Well, it says that children are like arrows in the hands of a warrior, right? We are releasing our children. They are the arrow. We are the arrow maker. That you couldn't buy one at a store. You had to make it. You had to make sure it was sturdy, that it would fly straight, that it was sharp. That way you would hit the target that you intended.
Yeah.
And so just like sin is missing the mark, we are training our children to not miss the mark. Just like that, we are
Absolutely.
God's children. He is
Yep.
aiming us and
Yeah.
preparing us to hit the mark.
He's the archer. Yeah. He's the archer. The Torah in this scenario is like the bow. It aims and directs. It gives the force behind it. It gives the energy and the direction, and we're the arrow. If we fly true to the guidance we're given, we'll hit the target.
I think it would be so cool to have a shirt or a hat or something that said "Fly Straight," because what a talking point that could be.
Absolutely. I think that's the goal, right? That's why we're doing this podcast. If you want to know who God is and what God expects from you, you have to go to his word and learn how to fly straight, right? How do I live at peace, biblically speaking, with my neighbor? Imagine if we as Christians just took stock in the word reconciliation. This idea in modern Christianity that you could just apologize to God for some horrific thing you've done to another human being doesn't exist in the Bible. I can't say, God, I'm sorry for what I did to John Doe over there, and I cut him off. I said some words I shouldn't have said, or I stole something from this place, or what. Oh, God, I'm sorry for what I did about that. You can't apologize. Biblically speaking, you can't apologize to God for what you did to somebody else. You have to go reconcile with that person, not just say sorry, make restitution. Imagine if just Christians did that one thing. It would dramatically change the way you wouldn't see so much fractured, sort of splintered relationships that are
Denominations.
They're like the hallmark of Christianity. Like they're like the thing it's known for: fractured, angry people mad at each other. Well, they don't apologize to each other. We don't reconcile. So that's the point of this podcast: is to try to understand the way God would do it. What are God's ways, and how do we apply them? Right. So what are they really saying, and then how do we come into alignment with that guidance?
No, I love that. I think that's beautiful. I think that we have talked now. This is our third episode about original sin, and you bringing light to some of these definitions, like specific definitions, has allowed us to have a really, really constructive conversation, like you said, without talking past each other. Once we know exactly what these terms mean, look how far we can take this and apply it now, instead of just using these buzzwords or Christianese, as you talked about. But look at how we can actually concretely apply these to our lives now. I just think that that's monumental in being able to discuss God's ways, his law, everything like that. It just gives so much more emphasis on what God actually desires of us, as opposed to just kind of throwing these words out there and not really understanding them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the danger you and I have, doing this sort of podcast, is like the Bible is a world filled with words, and we're trying to deconstruct the lens that we've put around them. Which has what I genuinely feel is most of sort of modern Christian theology, sort of this view. We distort often what words really say, what they really mean, to fit in our sort of ideological preferential boxes. And if you imagine, if you sit in a church your whole life, There are some that aren't this way, so this isn't universal. But where I grew up, we'll say, you'll sit in a church your whole for years, and you will hear a handful of passages just on repeat. You know, there's sort of this cherry picking of what we want to emphasize, and those things are just said, regurgitated, 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 sort of in a cult-like, repetitious manner, where you just,
Dogma.
yeah, this is what we believe, and so we don't really talk about anything else. And we're here to, like, well, let's blow the lid off of this. Let's see what let's see what the Bible really says. I can't say that I'm going to devote my entire life, which is finite, to a God who I don't really know, whose word I don't really understand, whose character I can't really investigate. You know, is God really just? Is he really good? Because if you're telling me to devote my entirety to him, I need to know that. And if I don't understand what I'm reading, I won't know that. And so that's the whole point of this podcast, is really to investigate who God is, to investigate what he expects of us, to understand Torah, to understand what is sin. Once we understand those things, we can really dissect things like original sin. Is this really what God is saying? No. And then if not, what does he think? You know, if original sin is a human invention, what does God really think about sin and those who have transgressed it? And I thought maybe this will be a good segue. I thought it'd be valuable, since we're talking about this, to let people know what is the ancient Israelite, first century Judean sort of context for when is somebody actually accountable for what they do. If it's not from birth, when? You know, if we've established that God doesn't hold those without the mental capacity to make decisions accountable, which I think is very obvious, there's got to be a certain point at which he does hold someone accountable. You know, we have like these ideas in law and Western thinking, and even somewhat within Christianity, about this idea of the age of accountability. So God commanded the fathers, like we mentioned earlier, to teach their children, and they did. And so there was this tradition of what we call a bar mitzvah. Bar here meaning son, or the female version is the bat, meaning daughter. So the bar, and then mitzvah is a commandment. So bar mitzvah, son of the commandment. Bat mitzvah, daughter of the commandment. What it was it was a time in the life where the son or the daughter would stand before their family, possibly the community, definitely some Torah teachers, or even maybe a rabbi, and they would recite the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And now this has changed over time. Modern bar mitzvahs are not necessarily the same. And the moment that they did that, they were now everyone acknowledged, you know what the word of God says. Now you are a son of the commandment, or you are a daughter of the commandment. Now you're responsible to keep it because you know what God says. Now you must keep it. Prior to that, the child, of course, could get in trouble for things, but the responsibility fell on the parents. You're not teaching them correctly. They did this bad behavior because you didn't teach them how not to. In fact, there's like this widely used. There's a passage in the Old Testament where it talks about you could stone a rebellious child. And I always ask people who bring that up, do you know how many times that happened in biblical Jewish history? And they're like, oh, no, thousands of times maybe. The reality is it happened 0 times. Not one time did that happen. Because there was a process. If you read the text, it's very obvious. The parents had to bring the child in front of the elders, and they had to present a case that that parent never did anything wrong in the way they taught their child Torah. If you couldn't do that, you couldn't stone the kid because the blame goes on the parent. You didn't teach them right. Of course they don't know. You didn't teach them. How could they know you didn't teach them? Can't stone somebody for something they didn't know.
That's
And so,
interesting.
yeah. And so, we have this example that really turns out to be an example for the opposite argument. God does not he does not condemn those who don't know what his expectations are. We read this in Romans 5, right? When we talk about between Adam and Moses, there wasn't a Torah. Yeah, there was sin, but there's nothing to compare it to. There's nothing to compare it up against. Here's Torah. This is God's way. Well, they didn't have that before Moses. So, I think it's important when we're talking about, well, if original sin isn't true and babies aren't born sinful, wicked little, horrible little creatures, in fact, they're born in God's eyes pure, then at what point can the man or the woman sin? It's the point at which they are aware of right and wrong. Now, maybe it's because they studied Torah, maybe they didn't have any exposure to it, but they have a conscience as well. And when they begin to rebel against what they know to be true, what they know to be right, what they know to be correct, and conversely do the opposite of that, that is the point they're accountable for what they've done. They will be held accountable for that then. So I would say it's usually around that age, 12 to 14 years old, somewhere around in there is when that person starts to become accountable for what they've done.
That's very interesting. It actually comes full circle there. You talked about reconciliation, right? And how beautiful and important that could be. You said something while you were demonstrating the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, and about how prior to that, the responsibility was on the parent.
Yeah.
So post that, it's very interesting because now the responsibility to hold that individual who is now accountable, the responsibility falls on the community. We all know that you know. And so if you transgress this Torah,
You're talking about the parent.
No, I'm talking about the community now, right?
Oh, got you.
Now the community knows that this individual has espoused that they know God's Torah.
They proved it. Yeah.
Exactly. You've proven it. Now we all will hold each other accountable for holding true to God's Torah. If you transgress it, of course, you need to come reconcile with me because I know you know. I know you knew and you still did it, right? But it's kind of full circle there. We all hold each other accountable now.
Well, and that's what's the beauty of the renewed covenant that we get through the Messiah is that he writes his Torah on our hearts and he gives us his spirit so that way we can know and we can it's not, if he would have only given us his commandments, that would have been enough. It would have been enough for us to say, well, we've been told. But he gives us the ability, the power, and the strength to do that through the indwelling of the Spirit of God, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in episodes and down the road. He writes his commandments on our hearts. It leaves us without excuse. And the point of it isn't for God to say, gotcha. The point is because he really wants us to do it. He wants us to have peace with him and peace with one another. That's his desire. His desire, I mean, we read that all the way back in Ezekiel 18. God's desire is not that anyone is destroyed. Like, that would be sick and twisted for the Creator to create these beings, trip them up, watch them fall, and enjoy the process. That is not what a father does. The father, that's a really perverted father. And in a literal sense, it's twisted logic, twisted thinking. What God is actually wanting is he's wanting us to see his ways, that they're good. We can choose for ourselves, but as a father, he's like, hey, watch how I do it. Watch my character. Watch how I behave. Do it this way. Watch. It will give you life. It will be good for you. So he's trying to teach us, but we're often so, in Christianity, our minds are so thinking, how do I break this down into a theological principle so that I can have the right theological, systematic theological, set of whatever. That's just not what God's trying to do. He's not wanting us to have this highly developed system of beliefs. Like I said before, and I'll always say this until I'm proven wrong, I don't think God cares at all what people think. I think he cares what we do. What we do is a reflection of who we are inside. That is the whole reason we exist on this earth. Life is a test to see if what you say you believe, what you might think or say you think in your head, is real. Do you think generosity is a good thing, or are you generous? Do you think kindness towards strangers is a good idea, or are you kind towards strangers? Life is to see what is within you, and God cares about that. That's the reason we exist on this earth. It is a test of the soul to see the character within it. And that's why God is leading us with breadcrumbs towards righteousness through his ways. It's not to develop a set of theological belief system points that make us think we're in a better place than we really are.
I love how you put that. And to be candid, I think that's actually a trap that I fell into. Back whenever I first started getting into the faith, I feel like I had this notion that if I studied, if I was meticulous and got everything right and had everything in proper order in my understanding of the Bible and everything like that, that I'd be good. I would have that. Really, what I was doing was replacing the relationship with God with my relationship with my theology. And that's so dangerous to do, because at the end of the day, like you said, it's about what we do. It's about our relationship with God and his Torah. Are we building the foundation on Christ, the Messiah, Yeshua, and him alone? Or are we building that foundation on stuff that can fall by the wayside, the sand, if you will, from the parable? Yeah. But I think that I did that at one point, and it doesn't lead to a fruitful life. It doesn't lead to a life that follows God's Torah, because you actually haven't concerned yourself with it. You've just concerned yourself with, can I win in the public square with this idea?
Yeah, I think that's exactly where it is. And this was the problem that Paul was constantly having to deal with, which is that the Hellenistic, or sort of Greek philosophical worldview, was who won the debate in the public stage had this sort of self-righteousness, right? This righteousness because I had the correct argument. The Hellenistic worldview was, the highest plane of a human being could be in the level at which they attained some correct view of the world in their thoughts and their ideas, and they could communicate them to the people around them. They didn't have a sense of righteousness in the sense that, like the Israelites had this idea of righteousness, which is right standing with God. the Hellenists, the Greeks didn't have that. They had this idea of sort of the mental ascent, this mental elevation into the plane of truth is what made you good, I would suppose. And we've let that linger in the mind of the Christian. The Western mentality is, if I have the right set of beliefs and thoughts, well, that somehow makes me good. God doesn't care what you think. God cares how you behave. We will talk about this at length. Now, I want to put this one thing out there. We got 3 minutes, I think, right?
Yeah.
You are not saved by what you do. Period. End of discussion. It's not possible. So I want people, when we're talking about things like Torah and doing things, I want to make sure people understand where we're coming from. And we will talk about this at length in subsequent podcasts, but or episodes. Salvation, redemption, that's one thing. Righteousness, that's a different thing. Again, we're talking about terminology. They're different. Salvation comes through atonement. This comes through the mercy, the chesed, the unmerited mercy of God that is demonstrated in the death of the Messiah, who died on our behalf. Because we talked about chata, sin leads to death. We all have sinned. We all will die, except he takes the punishment of that death on himself. Salvation and redemption are through the Messiah.
Amen.
How we live, what we do, is a demonstration of our loyalty to God, our obedience to God, and that is our righteousness. And we will talk about that in another episode.
No, that's awesome, man. I love that right there. Nothing better you could end on.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys next time.
Oh, you close it out with the prayer.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay. So if anybody wants to know, this is the Aaronic benediction or Aaronic blessing. I'll say it in Hebrew, then we'll do it in English real quick. Yevorecha Yehovah va'ishmerecha. Ya'ir Yehovah panav elecha vehunecha. Yisa Yehovah panav elecha va'yasim lecha shalom. V'Hashem Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you his shalom, his peace. In the name of Yeshua, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.